Thanks, Ed. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, coming through.
I once actually, last year, I did a talk for US Soccer, and it was one of those where I did the whole talk. It lasted an hour, and only at the end did I realize that technically there was a problem and they'd never heard a word. So I had to go back and redo it. So I've got to the habit now of checking. So firstly, let me remind you that I need to have that conversation with you about you being my agent. Because you did a good job there. But secondly, I'll also comment, of course, because when you invited me, you said I'd be the first speaker in the series. What you didn't tell me, there'd been 2 previous series. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But anyway, when Ed invited me, I thought, yeah, for sure, happy to come on and chat. I think originally I kind of got the perception it was going to be a little bit of a fireside conversation. But Ed reminded me that I probably needed to put a few slides together. So I think when I emailed him this morning, I said, I've got 4 or 5 slides. And as the day's gone on, it's become 18 slides. But again, I'm not going to talk for too long, hopefully 15, 20 minutes, just to put something out there that may constitute some kind of discussion. And we'll see where the questions go. We can talk around these topics, or we can go, much broader than that, as Ed was implying there. Ed did ask me at the start, I still have an affinity or an affiliation at the University of Utah. Probably not enough of an affiliation for this to be the first slide, but I just haven't got around to changing all my slides yet. And to be honest, I quite like the red and white, black, red and white on these. But yeah, I kind of left the University of Utah, certainly full-time employment there last summer. And in essence, left the snow for, there we go, for the beaches of Florida. So I'm now based in Pensacola, Florida, which is the westernmost part of Florida. In fact, it's so west in Florida that it's actually on Central Time rather than Eastern Time. But as you can see, this is Pensacola Beach here. So it's a very beautiful part of the world as far as beaches and so on are concerned. So this is where I currently work. In fact, my office is pretty much on the corner of the 2nd floor there with the balconies sticking out. So I work at the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. The institute was set up probably about 30, 40 years ago now. Originally, it was affiliated to the University of West Florida, but about 20 years ago, it became independent. So technically, I'm a state employee. So it's affiliated to all of the 12 universities in the state of Florida. So it continues to have an affiliation with the University of West Florida, but it's also affiliated to Florida State, University of Florida, and so on and so forth. Originally, the Institute started off doing work in robotics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, but we're trying to grow our resilience, health, and human performance research theme. And we've actually just secured $20 million to build another building similar to this one next door, which will focus exclusively on human performance. The Institute actually brings in about $160 million worth of grants every year. Most of this is for work with the military. So, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Special Ops in particular, and also NASA, as well as some commercial companies, are the type of work that we typically do research for. So still human performance work, still the same sort of methods, measures, paradigms, conceptual frameworks, but just a different population group. But similar issues, just slightly different challenges. So what I thought I'd do in this particular short talk is maybe just highlight 4 challenges that I think are quite important at the moment, and that we may need to spend a little bit more time focusing on moving forward. The first point here is, this concept of how do we develop game intelligence skills, and clearly over the last 3 or 4 decades, there's been quite a considerable amount of work that has identified the key perceptual cognitive skills that underpin superior anticipation and decision making. However, I would probably conclude that less of this research work has reached the front line, so to speak, in terms of it having an impact on practice in a very applied domain. And I still don't really know a huge number of sports, if any sports for that matter, that have sort of integrated perceptual cognitive test and training programs into the kind of work that they do on a day-to-day activity. So I think there's lots of interesting questions here that merit more empirical work that in turn would then guide applied practice. So there are questions along the lines of, how important is non-coach-led play activity in the development of game intelligence skill relative to coach-led play? And obviously there is some evidence to suggest that certainly in soccer, that and I think in cricket, that players who had superior game intelligence had actually engaged more so in street sport within the particular sport during development. Ultimately, of course, it may be less to do with play and practice and more to do with activity and the type of activity and the specificity of that activity, in so much as that it encourages people to make decisions that reflect the same decisions that they would make during competition. And, the only real difference between a play activity and a practice activity is really the role of the coach. So as I said, I do think activity is the key word there. So you could have a session that's obviously coach-led, that creates plenty of opportunities for players to make decisions and to engage in learning activities. And then similarly, there are play environments where coaches are not present, where those kinds of activities could take place as well. So it's more an issue of how hands-on and hands-off coaches should be in optimizing the development of game intelligence during practice. The question of whether perceptual cognitive skills transfer across sports remains one that probably hasn't attracted a huge amount of interest over the last couple of decades, with the exception of maybe one or two groups. Probably there is some transfer, but whether the degree of transfer that occurs is sort of fundamental in the development of expertise in the primary sport, I think remains open to question. Certainly from my perspective, I don't dismiss the possibility of transfer, but specificity seems to me to be the strongest rule here that guides activity. But I think we could certainly do more work with coaches to try and guide them in terms of the types of practice activities and the type of instruction and feedback that would better influence the development of game intelligence skills. Another interesting question is, to what extent are these perceptual cognitive skills developed through explicit cognitive function, if you like, and therefore are encouraged by processes of self-reflection and awareness that might be prompted by the use of video-based feedback and imagery. And that's an interesting question in itself, in the sense that if you, let's say you tested 100 athletes from any sport, soccer for instance, and you split them into a high-performing group and a low-performing group, would the high-performing group have a lot more explicit knowledge about the decision-making process and the kinds of information that they use in perceiving what will happen next? Or is a lot of this knowledge implicit, and they can't really articulate the thought process that underpin their decisions in those kinds of environments? And then, of course, what implication does that have in terms of the use of video-based feedback and imagery, which typically encourages the development of explicit cognitive skills? I mean, that may impact positively some aspects of decision-making, perhaps, but maybe not all aspects of decision-making. The other way, of course, to try and develop decision-making skills is to increase the frequency of opportunities for players to make decisions. And whilst that could also be done in a very practical on-field scenario, another group of methods that has emerged over the last couple of decades is the use of simulation-based training, which could involve film, VR, or even augmented reality, are all potentially interesting ways forward. And I guess over the last 5 years or so, there have been an increasing number of companies out there that are developing and marketing the use of VR as tools to develop game intelligence skills. Again, the kind of jury remains somewhat out on this particular issue. Whilst the technology looks quite sexy, I guess, in many ways, what I haven't seen, and again, I'd be interested to see if anybody else has got any observations on this, is what I would call, the holy triumvirate, if you like, the kind of picture a triangle, almost in a constraints-based model. And I think what we need here in one corner of the triangle is we need, obviously, companies that can develop the technology, the VR companies, the augmented reality companies, that allow us to mimic and recreate performance situations as accurately as possible. But on the other tip of the triangle, you need buy-in from a sport to engage heavily in this type of work. And then the third part of the corner of the triangle, tip of the triangle, is the role of skill acquisition specialists in working with coaches and technology companies to develop the instructional systems design aspect of this type of training. And I've yet to see or hear of a situation where all three points of the triangles are functioning in a very interactive and dynamic manner. So in that regard, I think we've probably made less progress than what one had hoped, maybe looking back 10 or 20 years ago, in extent to the degree to which these types of training programs are now routinely used by sports teams in high performance environments. So I think there's still a lot of questions that remain unanswered here on the instructional systems design aspect, in terms of, for instance, what perceptual cognitive skills do we train? Key usage, pattern recognition, use of situational probabilities, gaze behaviors. Can we train them in isolation, or do we need to train them in an interactive, dynamic manner? And, when do we develop these types of skills? At what age group, what skill level will these types of training programs be most optimal? So it continues to be a lot of mileage for potential work in that area. My second coaching challenge focuses on the importance of individual differences and the extent to which it's been relatively underexplored over the last 3 or 4 decades. Individual differences, probably most recently, has been highlighted quite nicely by some of the deliberate practice theoretical framework. And of course, the argument is we're all on this learning curve somewhere. And clearly what's important is not the passive accumulation of practice per se, but rather the hours accumulated in deliberate practice, which is purposeful, effortful practice to improve a certain level of performance. And, what do you need to progress from point A on the learning curve here to the next point along? And to some degree, this is a massively difficult challenge for coaches, because, and particularly those working in team sports. I mean, it's not uncommon for a football coach to be working with 16 or 20 players in a session. And of course, they're all on different points on that learning curve, and they've all got things that they do very well and other things that they don't perform so well. And I don't know how well we actually consider some of these individual differences in how we design, implement and deliver training programs. Ironically, when we actually allow experts to practice on their own, we do see that they do practice differently, in so much as that, they spend far more of their time practicing their weaker skills, whereas less expert performers spend more time practicing the skills that they're already good at. They invest more mental and physical effort in the process of practice, and they're much more engaged in processes of self-reflection, thinking about what they did right and what they did wrong, and what are they going to do differently next time. And often they maybe comment on the fact that they might find practice less enjoyable. I mean, this may be partly a reflection of the fact that certainly in one particular study, they were practicing technical skills as opposed to engaging in small-sided games, which may be deemed to be more enjoyable, perhaps. Or alternatively, of course, they may be practicing at a level, a desirable difficulty or a challenge point per se, where they may be failing more often. And consequently, the fact that they're failing more often may make the activity less enjoyable. But certainly some of this work also fits into the challenge point framework, I guess. And again, when you work in a group environment, you've got 16 to 20 athletes, then not only do they all have different strengths and weaknesses, but also probably the essential challenge point or desirable difficulty changes or varies quite markedly across those individuals. And I don't know how well we've kind of reflected on these issues, or certainly coaches working in the field. And then, you know, there's a range of other factors. I did a workshop for one of the MLS teams going back a couple of months ago. And, you know, the fascinating question that came up was this, what would be the right balance between maintenance training and growth training? So why my view as maintenance training might be a strong focus on performance. So you get high levels of performance, a lot of success in practice, whereas arguably you could argue that growth training is a stronger focus on learning, and you're practicing much closer to that optimal point around the challenge point or the desirable difficulty, and therefore you may fail more often. So, you know, there's a couple of interesting questions. You know, one, what is the optimal balance between maintenance training and growth training? How does that differ across age and different stages of development and expertise level? And, you know, what are these psychological characteristics possibly that may determine whether people are able to cope with high levels of growth training, to practice for longer periods of time around those desirable difficulty stroke challenge points. So factors like grit, perfectionism, mental toughness, resilience, coping, and achievement motivation, how do they impact on people's responsiveness to training? And I guess if you look at the modal learning literature generally, you know, most of what we know about motor learning is really based on aggregating scores from reasonably large groups of participants over blocks of trials. And then we draw conclusions that typically, you know, when you compare these 20 participants against that 20 participants, then variable practice is better than block practice, or you know, feedback every other trial is better than feedback every trial. But what we've really not addressed is how consistent those conclusions are within groups of individuals. So, you know, it may well be, again, coming back to the scenario of a coach working with 16 to 20 athletes again, you know, do all of them want variable and dynamic practice, or do some of them prefer block practice? And do some of them want a lot of instruction, a lot of feedback, and do some of them don't? And although we might know which conditions best promote optimal learning, there is that balance again between performance and learning. And when do we focus on performance? When do we focus on learning? And possibly how some of these psychological characteristics may impact on perhaps the answers to some of those questions. I still, my third coaching challenge refers to the fact that, you know, what we see is not always what we get as a coach. And this really relates again to the difference between performance and learning. And it's still probably something that I try and make sure that I get across to coaches. I still do quite a lot of coach education work, a lot of football stuff, obviously, but also across other sports. And I spend a lot of time and effort trying to highlight the differences between performance and learning. And of course, the fact that different instructional variables impact performance and learning differently, and try and alert them to the fact that if you want good performance in the session, then the general guidance would be, demonstrate often, provide lots of instruction, do specific block practice of a single skill, and provide feedback often and in a fair amount of detail. And clearly they're the conditions that the research suggests promotes optimal performance. But then if the focus is on learning, long-term learning, then maybe the philosophy from the coach should be, what is the least amount of information and instruction that I need to give the learner? Do I need to demonstrate at all? To what extent are the practice conditions random, variable and dynamic such that they reflect the demands of competition, stroke match play? And what is the least amount of feedback that I need to give the athlete so that the athlete can begin to process his or her feedback independently? So again, making coaches aware of those differences between performance and learning, and maybe having an open dialogue around when you might want to focus on performance and when you might focus on learning. I mean, clearly on a long-term trajectory, maybe the focus is far more so on learning, but I don't think it's a constant focus on learning. Sometimes there's a focus on performance, particularly where it impacts on confidence, for instance, in the short term. So we come back to this issue again around maintenance growth training and what are the psychological factors that may influence to what extent you focus on performance and to what extent that you focus on learning. And then finally, my fourth coaching challenge is how specific is specificity? I would argue that specificity is one of the strongest rules of science. But, for instance, there's a lot of research work that suggests that stress in all its various guises, whether that's anxiety, whether it's mental workload, whether it's physical workload, changes the way that we perceive and process information. So therefore, if we don't practice under the same conditions that exist during competition and match play, where often players are fatigued, they're anxious, their self-esteem fluctuates, they're experiencing a wide range of emotions, then the transfer from practice to competition might actually be quite small. So I come back to this issue, how specific does practice need to be relative to competition and match play before you get meaningful transfer? And one of the things I say to coaches as a rough guide all the time, actually, is whenever you watch a coaching session, whatever sport it might be, then maybe the first question you need to ask yourself is, does it look like the sport? Not just technically and tactically, but also emotionally, physically, physiologically. To what extent does it look like the match and the competitive environment? And often it doesn't, actually, because of this fact that coaches tend to break down and isolate skills for more repetitive practice. But I think it's an interesting question, and maybe a question that I throw out there sort of for discussion in a lot of these coach education sessions is, what if we could measure it, and we can't as yet, what would be a reasonable degree of transfer from every hour of practice to competition? So if I take an hour of training in football, working with whether it's kids or adults, to what extent, how much of that practice actually transfers to an improvement in performance? And if we could measure it, I suspect it would be far lower than what we would hope it would be. I may even hazard a guess that the transfer may be as low as 20%. Particularly when you consider some of the things that I've spoken about, the individual differences issues, the fact related to that of whether we're working at a sufficient level of desirable difficulty, the individual differences in growth and maintenance training and how we cope with that, the specificity argument, all I think are sort of key factors. And I suppose, well, we all know that experts, whatever their sport, accumulate a huge amount of practice hours over time. I mean, ultimately, I guess our role as part of our role as skill acquisition specialists is to make sure that they practice efficiently as possible. And I do think moving forward, we need to do better, perhaps, at being able to measure that efficiency and trying to find ways to improve that efficiency. And actually, while I mentioned that point, another point that's just raised is quite interesting as well. I've done a little bit of work over the years on sort of processing efficiency theory. And I'm kind of quite super interested in this differentiation between performance outcome and performance efficiency. So performance outcome, of course, is the change in observable behavior from an outcome perspective, improvement in score, more accurate passing, more accurate shooting at goal, fastest time in 100 meters. Whereas efficiency relates to the resources that we invest in the task. And some training benefits are not wholly apparent, are they, in the sense that we may be engaging in training. There's no change in outcome, but efficiency is improving. So in other words, we're using less cognitive attentional resources to perform the task. And I think maybe differentiating between performance efficiency and performance effectiveness might help us a great deal, actually, in evaluating the effectiveness of our training sessions as a whole. Anyway, all I want to do is just to throw out some starting points there for potential discussion. As I said, we can talk around those, or we can go in totally other directions. As Ed said, the book The Best came out last year. It's the white cover here is the hardback, black one is the paperback. I mean, the book's in 3 sections. The first section focuses on the social cultural influences on the development of expertise, so topics like relative age effect, talent identification, role of siblings, role of family, where you're born, role of genetics. Second section focuses on adaptations to practice. What are the psychological changes that occur? How do we develop perceptual cognitive skills? How do we develop the ability to cope with stress and depression? What are the key psychological characteristics? And then the final section looks more at sort of optimizing practice time and the role of technology in the development of sport. The book's selling fairly well. It's probably not selling as well as Outliers or Range, but maybe there's only so many books you can sell by being too truthful, and that maybe books that spin a story and maybe don't convey the facts as accurately generally sell well. But anyway, I'm very pleased with the book and the outcome of it. And those of you who read it and hopefully might read in future, hopefully you'll find it of interest as well. Thanks, Ed. I'm happy to open it out at this point.
Great, Mark. Thank you. You might just maybe pop on your camera, because I think people will just great. I know there's questions coming in from Alan and Phil, so I'll kick us off as a transition from what you've done. And thank you so much, Mark. Lovely as ever, nice and neat, and very clear and easy to follow. It's interesting that we've got Martin Dighton on here. He's from the team at UK Coaching. He's one of the coach developers at UK Coaching, and they're currently doing a series around the learning lab with all the coaches at UK Coaching. And one of the things we're discussing at the moment is that difference between the practice effect and the learning effect. That why do coaches expect to see something? Oh, we did it in practice, and why is it not working in training, or why is it not working in performance? Because maybe they don't have a good enough appreciation of that difference between maybe that, where learning maybe takes place and how long it maybe takes for something to become a learned skill. Yeah. What are your thoughts there? I know that might be something of interest to people, just that difference between practice effect and a learning effect.
Yeah, well, performance is observed behavior. And of course, if we provide lots of instruction, do specific block practice, provide lots of feedback, then performance tends to be good in the session, which visibly makes you think as a coach, and perhaps some who are watching the session thinking that's a great session. But the reality is that in order to infer that learning has taken place, We need to see that the change in performance observed during practice is retained into subsequent practice sessions, and that it obviously transfers to novel variations of that practice session and to competition and match play. So therefore, in order to evaluate learning, it's very much a long-term process. And sometimes a session which is structured and well organized and you think there's lots of learning taking place, that may not be the case. Whereas you could also get the reverse situation, that there's some sessions that may look a little bit chaotic, things that don't always go to plan, or things that you might plan as a coach and you think, well, this is not turning out quite as I thought, but maybe the kids are learning. Because ultimately, of course, you've got to remember that certainly in the context of football and most team sports are very dynamic, very chaotic. And ultimately, I come back to this issue, does it look like the game again in all its glory, in all its demands? And sometimes grid drill-based practices look good in that success is high, but do they reflect the technical, tactical, physical, physiological, mental demands of competition? So it's hard for a coach. In fact, to be honest, one of the things I always said is probably the hardest job going, because what other job do you not see the immediate outcome of what you're doing?
Yeah,
so you can only evaluate how good your coaching is by looking at it as a long-term process.
It's great to hear you, as we go over to Phil for maybe the first question from elsewhere. It's great to hear you talk about that kind of, if it looks a bit more chaotic, it might be a bit more effective. Because I see another friend of us here, Scott Sivright, is on here, and one of his mantras is embrace the chaos. If the training is a bit more chaotic because maybe the competition space is a bit more chaotic, maybe we should try and get them a little closer aligned. That's great to hear. Phil, over to you for some questions.
Yeah, so again, lots of really interesting points raised there. I want to start with one where you talked about the importance of managing individual differences within a group, within a team's training session in particular. And I guess how is it that skill acquisition specialists or coach developers can assist coaches to allow them to manage those individual differences more effectively? So is it a case of working with players to enable them to take ownership more? Players will often have key performance indicators for their game performance. Well, do players know what their key performance indicator is for this training session activities? They've got an individual focus. You've consulted with quite a range of different groups. Have you come across any examples where people they get that really well? So they help their players to get that individual focus within a team context?
Yeah. To be honest, I was reflecting on another conversation with a student earlier on, and I've actually, I've never worked with an athlete one-on-one. So all of my applied work has been through coach education, and I've done a lot of it. So, across different sports, I don't know, I probably must do at least 50, 100 hours of coach education a year, I guess. And I've done so for 20 to 30 years. But I don't really see how the coaches take those principles away and work with athletes on a day-to-day basis. And I know some of you, I know Ed and some of you guys, you do more day-to-day work. But yeah, it's an interesting, and probably that bridge, if you like, between research-driven work in skill acquisition and then how those principles and concepts are applied on a daily basis, that bridge isn't well built. So I still feel that I come in, I deliver the concept, but don't really get to work with coaches too much on a day-to-day basis to decide, okay, how do we put these principles into practice? And there's probably only a handful of people in my knowledge that are doing this kind of work on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, in the sense of, you would think that there would be a clear need for coaches to work with players to identify strengths and weaknesses, particularly the things that they need to work on. But, the problem is, the reality of it is, as I said before, is that often in many sports, coaches are working with large groups of athletes. And to some degree, it kind of argues that at least a reasonable proportion of training should be individualized, and that maybe coaches should be working on a one-on-one basis with athletes. or maybe not even coaches, but other support staff, skill acquisition specialists. So it's that issue of to what extent is it about the group and to what extent is it about the individual? That I think would merit a lot of work. But the other point I was trying to raise there, and I'm not really sure on the answer to this question, that most of our principles around what constitutes effective practice and learning driven by the skill acquisition literature is based on groups, in that we take the noise out of it. And ultimately we make conclusions that, look, of these 20 athletes, they all preferred random variable practice. But is that really the case? And what are the individual differences here? And to what extent is the group norm driving that's wagging the tail a little bit too much? And maybe we should be more cognizant of these individual differences. And maybe even engaging with athletes and trying to get a preference from them in terms of, do they like lots of instruction? What are their thoughts around blocked repetitive practice and the provision of feedback? I think are super interesting questions. And I really like that one around sort of maintenance and growth training. I think that's a big one for me. And it's linked into the issue of not only sort of factors like resilience, mental toughness, grit, but also self-confidence as well. Some athletes probably want to be at that level where they're being challenged and they don't mind failing and they've got the confidence and the resilience to bounce back from it. And then others don't. They want a more softly approach. So they want to feel that they're building blocks slowly and their confidence is improving slowly. And we know relatively little about that from a science perspective.
That's really nice, and I think I do agree with it that we take the noise out of the data oftentimes, and actually it's really fascinating when you look at the extent of individual differences, how fast some people in some groups, the fastest person in one group learns versus the slowest person in that group. You can get much larger differences than the manipulations that we're looking at.
Well, just on that, because I think it's an interesting point. One of this MLS group, one of the questions that came up actually is that we had a long debate also about talent identification and talent development. And, I'm certainly more in the talent development camp. But then the interesting question that came up in the sense that should we be identifying players who are better able to cope with that growth training? And then what are those if they are psychological characteristics that may make them more able to deal with those environments? So in other words, if our task as coaches is to develop optimal environments for the development players, then maybe we should be trying to select players who are able to cope with those learning environments and make those adaptations. So it was quite an interesting question from a talent ID perspective as well. The question being, how do we identify the players who are better able to deal with higher proportion growth training?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some really interesting bits. And you mentioned, that there are limited people who are working on bridging that transfer. And I think we're really lucky a little bit later in the series to have Ross Pinder and George Askew who are working in the Paralympic space coming up. So I'm very much looking forward to them. I was going to pass you over to Alan Dunson, I think, who has our next question lined up.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And it's just to kind of add to what you were just discussing in terms of maintenance and growth and performance and learning, and more of a, do you think we need more research similar to that by kind of Fabian Otte and Sarah Kate Miller and the periodization of kind of skill acquisition from that particular perspective, and how that kind of fits into the maintenance and growth aspect, especially for sports where every week there's a game to be considered?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I think I was, when I did the pro license for US soccer a couple of years ago, one of the head coaches said that they use a periodized model, that they actually did all their sort of more learning related stuff early in the week, particularly where it related to tactics and strategy, for instance, whereas later in the week, it focused to a much more performance driven aspect, which I thought, wow, that's a really interesting concept. And it makes sense intuitively. But again, I don't think there's been any empirical work on it, to my knowledge.
I think if I may just jump in there, I think one of the points you were making earlier, and of course, obviously, the point about, how the experts or the more elite are more inclined to go after their weaker skills. And of course, obviously, that's part of the work you and I did a few years ago.
Yeah.
Of the work that we've done since, or I've been looking at since, that seems to be a consistent trait. So again, is it about identifying those people who are comfortable being uncomfortable that we should be trying to attract a little bit more, and then having a slightly different approach to those who maybe aren't so comfortable yet at being uncomfortable? They may still have the same aspirations to develop and progress, but they just need, as you said, maybe a softer touch initially to make them aware of the benefits of, we're not saying it always has to be on your weaker stuff. Of course, you got to work on your strengths and so on.
Yeah.
But is there that balancing act there?
I think that's a fabulous question, Ed. And I'm just thinking of the dialogue that I had with this MLS club, in the sense that, what we obviously don't have is longitudinal data. So you may think, for instance, that some of these psychological characteristics may be related, as I said, resilience, mental toughness, achievement, motivation, perfectionism, self-confidence, all are factors. But what we really don't have is measures of these characteristics when players join the club, and then how these measures change over time. So, I suppose the question might be, do athletes who are better able to be uncomfortable, are there some sort of trait characteristics that they have coming into the sport? And/or is it something about the nature of the environment, in the sense that, clearly you have to have a growth-focused environment as well, don't you? So, I mean, clearly, if coaches are going to provide opportunities for players to fail and then absolutely hammer them when they fail, then probably that isn't going to be a very positive environment for growth and exploration, because there's going to be a fear of failure. But I guess if you're able to create a practice environment which encourages players to express themselves and not to fear failure, and to see failure as an opportunity to learn from it and to do things differently next time, then then that's a very different environment. So we don't really know whether these are differences in so-called trait factors, or whether they are partly driven by the nature of the environment that's created by the coaches in these kinds of scenarios. So you need to create the right mindset that allow players to explore and grow, and not to be uncomfortable about failure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to go over to Ali. I'll have a question from Ali, just to take us maybe on to maybe some of the other aspects of some of the things you spoke about. Ali?
Yeah, I think there's a number of questions coming in the chat there, so I think I'll go back to Phil, give some of our online people an opportunity to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a series of questions coming through. I might start with Danny. So Danny, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, and then we'll go over to Omar after that, just to line people up in terms of the order. So over to you, Danny.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes?
Loud and clear.
Good. Thank you for joining, Mark. It's the first time I've actually heard you speak, so it's exciting. I would try and keep the question brief. I consume a lot of the podcasts that go on. So Rob Gray's podcast is a popular one I listen to, and there was a recent article that came out, Ashford 21, and he tried to combine information processing and ecological dynamics together in decision making. And Rob Gray disagreed on his podcast. And I was wondering what your perspective of combining the two approaches together. Can you combine them? And if you can, is that the direction we should be taking with decision making, or can't we because of direct and indirect? Hopefully that question makes sense.
Yeah, my view would be that I think this differentiation between cognitive and ecological psychology is significantly over-egged, to be honest with you. If you go back and read, for instance, the article that Nikki Hodges and I wrote for JSS in 2005, it goes something like effective practice and instruction in soccer challenging tradition. And it was mainly written from a cognitive psychology perspective. But if you look at the practical implications of it, it pretty much mirrors whatever article you would read written by someone with a bigger slant towards dynamical systems theory. So, and in fact, the notion of manipulating constraints, which I'm wholly supportive of, is not a conceptual framework. It is a working framework, but it's not a theoretically driven framework. So I think in essence, it seems to me that we're all arguing pretty similar things, in the sense that the question of what is the least amount of instruction that we need to provide, is that not what we're saying from a cognitive psychology and a dynamical systems ecological perspective? The fact that practice must mimic the demands of competition as best as possible, and a great way to do that is to manipulate the constraints. I guess I'd say that, whether my theoretical framework was cognitive science or ecological psychology. And then, let's provide the least amount of feedback and focus on being more hands-off in the process than hands-on. So I purposely do not talk about theory when I do any of my coach ed stuff, because I think it's just psychobabble that confuses coaches. And to some degree, I just give practical tools around what we know about learning. So to some degree, I don't, if I was being cantankerous, which I probably more often am, and controversial, I'd say that it's hindering us rather than helping us, this debate, because it just confuses coaches. And obviously, I come from a coach background, and I once had a debate with a colleague of mine, I won't mention the name, and we had this debate in the sense that his argument was that coaches need a good theory. And my argument was, really? I don't think really coaches know what a theory is. What they want is tools, and they want guidance as to what to do in that situation. And I think I've always had that belief, to be fair.
Really interesting. There's several really nice points to unpack there, or to maybe think about after the session. I'm going to move on because we've got a few more questions coming in. I'll try and get as many as we can. Omar, over to you, and then we might go over to, I think it was Scott after that. So over to you, Omar.
All right. Thanks, Mark. It was very interesting. You talked about the future
just to be sure on that. I'm not, just to be put just the fact, I'm not saying that theory isn't important. What I'm really saying is that from a practical coaching perspective, it probably doesn't matter whether you're embracing one theoretical perspective or the other. The behaviors are the same. That would be my point of view, just to be clear on that. Sorry, Omar, off you go.
That's okay.
Ed's enjoying himself.
No, it's quite all right. So as I said, you talked about the future of coaching in regards to technology, and I was involved in something like that with the military. So how do you see the latest technological advances, AR, VR, individual fast data collection? How do you see them providing or assisting us with adapting the difficulty to the individual's progress? Because as you said, in the research, we usually take how the group has performed, but we have it's very difficult to see the individual performance or the individual learning. So what I'm asking is, do you see that in the near or later future, the technology helping us in achieving or assisting us in progressing the individual more?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I guess there's no doubt that technology will play an increasing part in the development of elite athletes moving forward. And I guess, it's also part of the deliberate practice model, isn't it? In the sense that feedback, being able to measure and quantify performance as accurately as possible, and being able to provide feedback on that importance is an integral part of the learning process. Having said that, I don't think it's our biggest challenge, because even when we had relatively little technology, I think we were still investing too little time in interaction between skill acquisition specialists and coaches. So, no matter how good your technology is, if you don't get the instructional systems design part of it right, then it ain't going to work. So, you can spend millions on a VR system that's state of the art, but if you're not setting up your practice in the right way, providing the right type of instruction, providing the right feedback, structuring the practice in an appropriate manner, then it really isn't going to work. So whilst I wouldn't want to slow down the growth in technology, and we've got no control of it, and it continues to mushroom, what I'd like to do is to emphasize more so the need for skill acquisition specialists to work more closely with coaches. And I still think coaching is one of the hardest jobs in the world. And I don't think there's been enough research over the last 30, 40 years. I mean, if you look at the growth in sports science, for instance, I mean, sports science has made a massive difference in areas like diet and nutrition, strength and conditioning, performance analysis, and a range of different areas. But ultimately, the people who work more so with the athlete are the coaches. And obviously what the coaches are doing with the athletes most times is developing skills. So to some degree, a lot of the investment on sports science has been in, if I use the Christmas cake analogy, it's been on creating the icing for the cake. Whereas really, the body of the cake is skill acquisition focus. So there's a need for coaches to work more closely with skill acquisition specialists to optimize the return on practice efficiency. And yes, technology plays a part in that cycle of performance learning, performance enhancement. At the end of the day, I think we need to provide better support for coaches. And I think coaches need to work more hand in hand with skill acquisition specialists to make sure that the knowledge is, it's a two-edged pathway, really, in the sense that I think there's a need for coaches and skill acquisition specialists to work more closely together to make sure that the science that already exists is disseminated more so into practice. But I think there's also a need for coaches to highlight to skill acquisition specialists the areas that we really need more information about, and the type of work, some of it which has been discussed in this Zoom for the last half an hour or so, that we still don't really know enough about. And until we get more dialogue between these groups of people, I just think we'll continue to make relatively slow progress, irrespective of what happens on the technology front.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Omer. Thank you very much, Mark. We might jump over to Scott next for our next question.
This is a little bit, just one other point I kind of make, really, in the sense that, I've been in this field 30, 40 years, and I think one of the interesting, Ed asked, maybe talk about future directions, and have we made progress? And I say, yeah, a little bit. Not anywhere near as much as I think we should have made. So we've still got barriers there that are preventing substantive and significant progress. And I just don't think we're investing enough money on research and development to underpin coach education and coach development. And I remember a few years ago, I had the FA got large amount of money from McDonald's, and they were going to fund 70 skills coaches. And I kind of wrote to the technical director of the FA at the time, and I suppose one argument which I thought was quite funny, in the sense that if they've appointed 70 coaches to develop skills, what are the other coaches doing? Aren't they developing skills also? But the one thing that worried me more than anything is, well, who's coaching these skills coaches? And where's the new knowledge and new research coming from? So I think what I suggested to the technical director at the time was, well, listen, why don't you employ 65 skills coaches, and the savings you make from not appointing the other 5, why don't you set up a research and development group where scientists can work with coaches and skill acquisition specialists and begin to charter out a program of research work that will better inform coaching practice and improve coaching efficiency moving forward. And that conversation was probably 10, 15 years ago. I don't think we've moved forward at all in that period of time. I'm playing devil's advocate to a degree. I'm happy to hear any arguments that suggest otherwise. We have moved forward, yes, for sure. And these kinds of groups and workshops testify that, but we've moved forward very slowly, I would say.
again, there's some really interesting aspects that we could get further into there and explore further on that. But I'm going to pass over to Scott for our next question, and then I might go to Jared for the last question after that. Over to you, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for taking my question, guys. Hi, Mark. One thing that you briefly covered there was the deliberate practice being inherently unenjoyable, and that was kind of reassuring to me, because I always assumed that was just meant it was boring, but you're kind of reassuring me that it's not so much boring, it's just frustrating more so. So it's not inherently disengaging, it's just less enjoyable. So thanks for that. Anyway, my question was, what we're trying hard to do, teach martial arts, is really indoctrinate or condition and foster and cultivate fierce independence with our learners, and have them almost, an increasing part of practice now is having them constrain themselves. Once they get some of the basics down and some of the principles here, we're actually pushing more and more over to them, given that the challenges in having big group practices. Can you speak to anything about that, about getting the athletes themselves more involved and like creating this kind of independence?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand with this general focus over the last decade or so for more hands-off approaches to coaching, whether you're looking at it from a cognitive science or from an ecological dynamical systems perspective. We're all arguing the same thing, in the sense that, you know, rather than the more traditional approach to coaching, perhaps, whereas the view would be, you know, I am the coach, own all the knowledge, and I will prescriptively give it to you. I think the argument now is to try and put as much onus as possible on the athlete to learn independently and to take ownership and control over their own learning. So therefore, my role as a coach is to act as a catalyst, to stimulate and create an environment for the athlete to learn independently. So I think, you know, that philosophy and how we do that is very, very important. And it is a real challenge, in the sense that whilst on the one side, I'm a big advocate of the constraints-based approach, irrespective of the conceptual framework you pin to it. It's a difficult one, though, isn't it? Because at the same time, some coaches might see it or might not be able to deal with it any more than, well, I'll just let the kids play. But the reality of it is coaching through a constraints-based approach is much more difficult, because it necessitates a much deeper understanding of the sport and a knowledge of, you know, if I change this aspect about the task or the environment, then it changes behavior in this way. You know, there's nothing easier. And when I started off coaching, you know, and when I was a student, I used to go off to the States coaching soccer. And then obviously what you do, you go 101 best soccer drills. And, you know, you organize the drill and you go. Whereas clearly it's only when you get more experienced and more knowledgeable and have, you know, more hands-on experience of how it works, that you begin to understand how certain constraints influence and shape the learning environment. So, and it's also a difficult challenge. And actually, you know, this is an interesting question as well, isn't it? And I was doing a workshop in Vegas the other day, and there was about 300 soccer coaches in there. And, you know, the interesting bit is that I think these constraints-based approaches and these issues that we talk about, desirable difficulties and challenge points, are probably things that are really relevant for skilled athletes, certainly for super skilled, but those who are progressing in development. But then if you think about, you know, most of the coaches in that room are probably working with kids who probably just want to enjoy playing soccer, and who probably just want to develop a lifetime of skills so that they can be physically active. And they probably, you know, don't want to be professional soccer players. And in fact, probably a very small proportion of the athletes that the coaches are working with, maybe 0.1% of all the players that all those 300 coaches are working with, it will get anywhere near professional soccer. And I guess the interesting bit then is, well, okay, well, maybe we should be a bit more prescriptive. Maybe the feel-good bit, the performance is more important than the learning. So I don't think that's the point that gets acknowledged sufficiently either. And I suppose to some degree, the argument is, well, ultimately what you need to do, of course, is make sure you've got the right coaches with the right skill set, working with the right athletes in the right environment at the right time. So what that looks like if you're working at a Premier League academy, for instance, by way of example, is probably very different to if you're working with, the local youth soccer team in whatever small town you're working in across the UK or across the globe, to that matter. So it's not always easy, is it? Performance and learning, when do we focus on one and the other? So it's a timing issue, it's a coaching issue, it's an athlete issue.
Again, some lovely elements in the answer there. And something I want to highlight as well, just because we're talking about learning from different domains. So Scott, you're talking about coming from a martial arts domain, but obviously you've got adventure sports coaches for whom coaching for independence it's an imperative within that sport because of the culture in the sport, because of the safety elements that are higher. So, I wonder, have you had conversations with adventure sport coaches as well that might give you another angle in terms of some of the things that you're looking at there, and that emphasis of, what can we learn from different domains? I know we're running over time quite a bit.
Can I just add one general point, which I think is interesting before the session closes, around this particular issue, in the sense that, that I always acknowledge in the coach education workshops that there isn't a recipe book for coaching, and that, there's an art to coaching, and there's a huge amount of professional knowledge that goes into coaching. So I always say at the start, in the sense that if you're expecting answers from me, you're going to be disappointed. So I'm not here to give you answers. My role is just to try and increase your professional knowledge. But I understand the fact that there's a huge amount of craft knowledge that goes into the process of coaching, and a huge difference in how you apply these principles and when you choose to apply them in the right time. And that comes through this craft. And to some degree, it's an art. And there's no reason why the art of coaching cannot be informed by the science. And that's what I try and do. But ultimately, it's still an art. And there's a huge amount of craft knowledge that goes into successful coaching.
So we've had some really helpful comments from Jared through the chat for the last little bit. But I think his last question that he's just popped in there is a really nice one. Jared, do you want to come on and just ask that? Because I think it kind of comes together with a lot of things we're trying to do going forward in this series, but also deals with one of the center points that we've had within the session as well.
Yeah, so you can hear me okay. Thanks for your presentation, Mark. Great insight as always. I just think it's interesting because obviously I'm doing my PhD around feedback, use of feedback terminology, and I'm really in particular the language that we use, because I think it's important. And often in coaching, obviously my background's in football, as you know, there can be sometimes resistance to certain terms. And I'm just wondering, just on one of your last points there, is performance the right word? Because often we talk about learning versus performance, but actually, and creating that sort of like dualism, if you like, but actually you can learn whilst performing. So my question is performance the right word? Because even when I've seen this delivered at club level, or even stuff that I've done as a head of coaching or whatever, I've often found, even in the room, I'm questioning it myself, and even the audience themselves, coaches at academies and what have you, they're wrestling with it and they don't necessarily agree. I'm just wondering, with the literature, what do you think? Is it the right terms? That's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess those particular terms come from the traditional model learning literature, right. In the sense that performance is observed behavior, and then we have retention stroke transfer tests to measure learning, so to speak. I mean, yes, in terms of whether those terms are as coach friendly as possible, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I alluded to that point earlier on as well, in the sense that, I think some of these sort of terminology that comes out of ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory again is probably unnecessarily complex for coaches. And maybe that's something that we need to do better as skill acquisition specialists as well, is to sort of be better at getting the message across and maybe simplifying it. rather than sort of making it too flowery and difficult. So whether there are better terms to use than learning and performance, I don't know. But and yeah, even though I think that seems quite clear, sometimes I look at the faces of coaches and think, no, we're not quite getting it, which maybe suggests that there may be an easier way to do it. But I think talk can help in this regard. These kinds of sessions help a little bit, but I still think that what really needs to happen more so is that in addition to having these kinds of workshop and the general coach education programs, I think skill acquisition specialists and coaches need to work together on a daily basis to try and discuss what some of these concepts mean and how we actually put them into practice. I don't think we've done that particularly well. The only person I think who probably has done quite well on doing that over the years is Damien Farrow when he worked at the Australian Institute of Sport. That was his job, really. Yeah. His job was to work with the different coaches. And I know he did a lot of work with Eddie Jones, for instance. And some of you may know of other examples. I know, for instance, Ollie's done some work. Ollie Logan has done some work when he was at GB Archery. And I'm sure a lot of us have, but I don't think there's enough of that that's going on. And I don't think what is going on is probably sufficiently well documented. And there's enough discussion around it to open up understanding and create a dialogue.
I couldn't agree more, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges we've got, is that we're creating this research and there's a lot of detail in the literature, but actually, who are we creating it for? We're creating it for the coaching fraternity, if you like, the coaches who are on the pitch with the under 8 girls or under 18s or whatever at different levels, but actually they can't necessarily understand some of the research and the terminology that they use or the jargon. And I think that's a great point that you made. It's a huge struggle, and also a lot of it is overly complicated messages when actually we're talking about very similar stuff. Just lastly, I wanted to make a quick comment. Just on that point, I could also bring it back to the issue between professional knowledge and craft knowledge again, can't we? In the sense that, I said that when I go and deliver these sessions, yes, I'm hoping to improve professional knowledge, but there's also part of me, I guess, having been a coach myself, that thinks, well, I want to get into that craft knowledge bit. And I'm not sure the coach education programs do that particularly well. And, I always use an analogy that I say that I use a golf analogy, in the sense that I think coach education programs probably teach you how to use every club in the golf bag, but they don't really teach you how to play around the golf. So, if we take the analogy across all sports, how do we do that? If we give people the skills, but how do we get them to use that professional knowledge and then to apply it through their craft knowledge and to play a good round of golf and shoot under par? And philosophically, that's something that we haven't done well at. No, I think a lot of the content at the minute, and I can say this myself because I'm a UEFA coach developer, a lot of it doesn't go beyond the X's and O's. There's a lot of what, but not necessarily enough how. I mean, for the individual different stuff, that's interesting, because often, from my experiences, we would design individual difference by you mentioned like manipulating constraints, but it might be certain areas of the pitch are different. So, for example, it could be if it's an attacking, we're working on certain principles, phase of play, whatever the activity is, it doesn't really matter. But because of the design of the activity, it's going to challenge certain players differently based on other areas of the pitch, wherever they're at. So each individual has certain challenges based on the individual differences and of course, their needs. But with that, I think feedback is a huge part, because often coaches are giving information, and a lot of the research you've done is great around the prescribing the answer. It's very error correction and that type of thing. But we're not necessarily tapping into the perception of what the player's seen. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts around, obviously, Newell's work around learning as searching and drawing on that around how can we use feedback to guide the visual search of the athlete? Because that's effectively what I'm doing as my PhD now, is that looking at when we're designing these differences and we're designing activities that are offering choice and problems to solve, how is the coach using information that's going to guide the attention or the visual search for the player so they can use that information from the environment to come up with their own solution, as opposed to prescribing the coach's perception without actually tapping into, well, what did the player see, or how can we guide them? Because a lot of coach education, and I've come right through the pathway up to A license and so on. I've taught on the pro license courses and so on. The whole content, as you've just said there, is typically designed to teach coaches how to tell players, athletes, where to look, what to do, and how to move. Yeah. But yet we're saying that we want these adaptable, self-learner, self-regulating athletes. It's contradictory in terms.
Well, I mean, I guess you could couch it in two different philosophies, aren't you? And I think historically, the classical approach is, as you've articulated there, in the sense that the coach gathers the knowledge, and then the coach, probably through stop, stand still, don't do this, do that, conveys that knowledge to the learner. Whereas I guess you could look at it the other way around, in the sense of, can we create an environment where potentially those skills might emerge naturally? And if they don't, then maybe where could I provide some kind of instruction or guidance that may increase the chances of that performance occurring independently? So that's that professional and craft knowledge again, in the sense that there isn't a recipe book that can go, yeah, actually do this at this point. It's a gut feel judgment. And you don't even know whether you got it right, because what you see is not what you get. So it's something that grows and develops over time. And the other bit, which I think is a fascinating point as well, which kind of slightly different topic, but is equally interesting in the sense of this continual balance between replication and realism. Okay, so this is the challenge for the coach. Let's say you've got a wide right midfield player who's struggling with his or her decision-making in football. So you have at least two choices here, right, on the continuum. Well, you could create a small-sided situation, a phase play scenario, where the ball is in that area of the field, and then the plus point is you get lots of repetition. Okay, so you can control it and you can get lots of repetition. But the question is it realistic in the sense that, you've cut off half the field. So the player won't be playing a diagonal 40-yard ball, because there's no diagonal 40-yard ball. It's like a 20-yard by 40-yard grid or zone. So you've got this balance between replication and realism. And that's also a difficult challenge for the coach in terms of, how much is replication important and how much is realism important? That's quite an important point now.
Yeah, great point. But I think as well is that you can, I wouldn't want to say sacrifice some realism, but let's say I was to constrain the player by creating a certain area. I think as long as the coach has got a rationale behind what they're doing.
Jump in there, Jared. Just for instance, time I'm going to be a nasty person. So pause the discussion, Jared. You can carry this on if you just stay on. We'll finish the webinar. So just pause.
Go for
it. So sorry, I have to be the bad person that stops it. We're just conscious of time for everybody.
Good constraint, Ollie. Good constraint.
So Mark, lots of information there, probably lots of questions. If people wanted to get hold of you or ask you further questions as a follow-up, what's the best mechanism to do that?
Yeah, just my email probably. I think I put it on at the start there, but I'm still picking up the Utah email, and they've got the new IHMC email. So but I'm happy to I as a reasonable player myself and a background in coaching, I'm always interested to discuss these kinds of issues. So I'm often happy to jump on a phone call or a Zoom if anybody feels they want to reach out. Always try and be as helpful as I can. I said, on the basis of the fact I don't know all the answers, but I'm happy to talk about it.
If anybody does want to get in contact with Mark, and please feel free to contact us on MSA Ireland on Twitter, and we can share contact details if you're struggling there. Just to wrap up the session, a big thank you to Mark for your generous time this evening. It's very much appreciated. Just to point everybody in the direction of our next webinar next week, which is on next Thursday the 17th, and it's with Stephen Casey, who is Cork Hurling Head of Strength and Conditioning, and he's going to chat about how he applies some skill acquisition principles within his coaching. So that's next Thursday at 6 o'clock. Keep an eye on our Twitter at MSA Ireland for details on how to register. So without any further ado, I want to thank Mark again. Thanks for your attendance, and hopefully see you all soon. Have a good evening.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mark.